The pipes that supply the Chinese with Russian crude tap different fields than the pipes that supply the Europeans with Russian crude. And if you can't get Russian crude from the West onto a tanker, there is no way to get it to China. It just gets shut in. In fact, we might see Chinese imports of Russian oil and natural gas drop. I'd estimate that about half of the oil and natural gas production in Russia is only possible because Western companies have come in and showed the Russians how to do it, especially with newer fields in eastern Siberia, the ones that are critical for China. Well, every American and European super major has withdrawn, and the next rounds of sanctions, while they might not necessarily target energy sales, they're certainly going to make it more difficult for the services firms like Halliburton to get and carry out normal operations in Russia. The only question is whether or not the drop-off in Russian output is going to be gradual or steep. I'd argue it's going to be steep. One of the things we saw back in 1989, when the Russian system, the Soviet system, collapsed, is when there wasn't enough demand in Russian industry, pressure started building up in the pipes from the point of consumption or the point of sale all the way to the wellhead, and they had to shut the whole thing down. Because Russia's weather is erratic and harsh, and because most Russian production is in the permafrost, even a short-term shutdown can mean you can never use that well again. It took them 32 years to repair that damage and get back to production levels that they had back in 1989. They had only gotten there like a quarter ago, and now they have to go through it all over again. So, is China a beneficiary of this? I don't see it, but it doesn't really mean that anyone else is either. Oil prices are going up, and if you remove Russia's 5 million barrels of crude exports a day from the market, if we stop at $200, I'd consider us lucky.
Well, for the United States, these are good problems. Yes, we'll have inflation, but it's because we're rebuilding things here in the United States in a constrained environment. I would have liked to see this 5 to 10 years earlier before we had the labor crunch, but here we are. We'll make it through this. But in East Asia, now the labor crunch situation in East Asia is far worse than it is in the United States. Because while we have millennials, they don't. And they also have something called the one-child policy, which has been gutting the Chinese demographic for 40 years now. And China is now the fastest collapsing demographic in human history. And there is no way the PRC survives the next decade in its current form. They just don't have the tax structure and the labor structure to even try. So this was always going to fail this decade. COVID may be speeding things up a little bit. And the end of China as kind of a major center weight in the East Asian geopolitical structure, that is something that is going to reverberate for decades to come. Now, from the American point of view, this is all a net gain. From the Japanese point of view, this is all a net gain. But for some of the countries that were trying to have their foot in both worlds, have their cake and eat it too, this is a bit of a disaster. So if you are Korea or say Thailand or maybe even India, where you've tried to balance your security needs with the United States, your economic needs with the Chinese, you're about to lose both because the Americans are no longer interested in patrolling the world and they're resourcing their entire manufacturing system. That doesn't leave a lot else for anyone else. So demographically, they're in collapse. There's no way we can rework that. The Chinese are releasing bits of their 2020 census now, and they're grudgingly admitting that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million, all of whom would have been born since one child, and most of whom would have been women. So even with like some low-level cloning, China's not going to survive this decade. They don't even have the numbers to try. Second, the Chinese have a lot of ships, but most are very small, and almost all of them can't sail more than 1,000 miles from port, and only that if they're moving slow and not dodging and no one's shooting at them. So the Chinese don't have the naval capacity to go out and secure markets or resources. They are entirely dependent on the U.S. Navy to do that for them. And to think that a core tenet of the U.S. national policy in this era is to bleed and die so that the Chinese can import raw materials and export finished goods, that strikes me as a stretch. Third, they've lost their government. I think one of the biggest problems they're having right now is the chairman himself, Xi Jinping. He's enacted a cult of personality that is tighter than anything that has ever existed through Chinese history. And it's gotten so tight that no one wants to bring him information about anything, and no one wants to do anything if they think it's going to clash with what he wants. So we have this policy paralysis throughout the entire Chinese system. They are now incapable of changing. I think the best example I can give you is that in Shanghai, they are now literally disinfecting runways at the airport because of COVID fears. There's just no functional policy coming down from the top, because when you only have one dude, can you imagine if you're in a Fortune 500 company and the CEO had to direct every specific thing, him or herself? Now, do that for a country of 1.4 billion people, 1.3 billion people. Everything is seizing up. They're not making progress on transport. They're not making transport in the information or the digital economy. They're bringing down their own stock market because they've turned everything into cult of personality economics. This is how countries die. It's a nice thought, but Xi has really done everything he could to purge the system of all potential rivals. And that has included intimidating into silence or imprisoning anyone who is capable of independent thought within the bureaucratic system. So you never want to rule out something like a coup. It could happen, but if that did happen, it's difficult to see whoever would pull it off to be able then to control the country on the other side of it. They might be a regional leader and they might be fine for their region, but the rest of the Chinese system would have a different opinion on who should be in charge. That's how civil wars begin. So I don't think that's a great thing to put your hopes into if you're hoping for China to remain part of the international system. In the case of Russia, it's not quite so tight. But which is not to say that it's not tight. There's probably 6 people remaining that have access to Putin on a regular basis, 3 of whom are toadies and who are incompetent. That's like the defense minister Shoigu or Medvedev, the former president. And then there's 3 people who are actually intelligent, like Patrushev, who ran the KGB for the longest time, or FSB now, or Igor Sechin, who's in charge of the state oil concern. But of everyone within the Russian elite, the only one who might have the guts to actually off Putin is Igor Sechin himself. But if there's one thing everyone else in Russia agrees upon, it's that Igor Sechin is kind of a prick, and they would all kill him if he actually tried. So there's not a lot of hope in terms of Kremlin watching or Forbidden City watching in terms of what might be a smooth transition from these 2 leaders. When the COVID disruptions were about substitution, the disruptions we're now starting to see are about flat-out replacement. We know that the system that made everything that we know in 2019 is not coming back. We know that the Russian materials are falling off the market. If it's not because of boycotts or sanctions, it's going to be because a lot of the productive capacity in Russia was done by Western technocrats, especially if you're talking energy in Eastern Siberia, which is the stuff that feeds into China. And then the Chinese can't adapt anymore. In that sort of environment, we need to rebuild a fundamental system elsewhere. That takes time. That takes money. Not really. It takes 10 years to bring a new potash mine and processing facility online. It takes at least 3 years for a nitrogen system or a phosphate system. The Chinese have removed phosphate from the system because they're concerned about food security in their own country.
These are fertilizer materials you're talking
exactly.
about, correct?
Sorry. Yes, fertilizer. And China used to be the world's largest phosphate exporter. Potash comes from Belarus and Russia primarily. Canada is a big supplier, and so this is good for the United States, but for everyone else, it's kind of screwed. And there are some new facilities that are coming online, but they were already kind of baked into the math because they've been coming for years, so we knew they were coming. There may be a little bit of surge capacity, but it's already too late for the Northern Hemisphere's planting season. I mean, if you're going to apply fertilizer, you've already done it this year. And fertilizer prices based on type are up between 50 and 200%. That means in the United States, we have seen a significant amount of crop switching as farmers choose outputs that don't require so many inputs. And that's something we can do here because we can finance the difference. It's not a problem, but most of the world doesn't have access to something like farm credit. Now, you go to the rest of the world, and you're talking about farmers either not planting on what they consider to be their marginal lands because those will only produce with fertilizer, or using less fertilizer for the crops that they just choose to grow. So we know we're going to have a poorer harvest on a global scale, but we're not going to know just how bad that is until probably the end of the third quarter, beginning of the fourth quarter. And then the final piece is, of course, grain stocks. We have about 2 months globally in terms of stocks we've saved up. But half of that is in China. And every time the Chinese have tried to tap their grain stocks, they've discovered that it's rotted almost to nothing because their storage facilities are awful. In the case of some of the grains, they don't even have facilities. They just literally make a big pile of it along the side of all the roads. And then lo and behold, half of it rots in 2 months. So we really only probably have 4 or 5 weeks in terms of reserves, and that's very concentrated in specific countries. By the time we get to October, we're going to have a very solid idea of just how short we are. Part of the reason that we're not panicking about the food situation right now is most of the world at the moment is eating last year's harvest. And so there was no problem with the input into the system. And so when you can't really tell what India is going to produce in 4 months, you look back and you see the flows are fine. That's helpful to a certain degree, and it certainly takes away some of the panic. It's not until we start the harvest season in the Northern Hemisphere that we're really going to have a good idea. Now, with energy, the shock has not yet hit. The Indians are proving willing to run the potential blockade and the potential embargoes and the potential boycotts in order to get Russian crude on the cheap. And as long as they are doing that, there's probably about 1 million, maybe 1.5 million barrel more of demand out of the world for Russian crude than there would be otherwise. Now, with the Europeans on May 30 deciding that they were going to go ahead with an oil block, that is going to make about 2.5 to 3 million barrels of Russian crude homeless. That's a big deal. So we're only now getting to the point where there's significant, permanent reductions on Russian output. And if that holds for just a few weeks, pressure will build up within the Russian system through their pipes all the way back to the wellheads, and they're going to have to shut it in. And as a rule in the permafrost, once you shut it in, that well is now never going to be turned on again because you get cracks throughout the system from the pressure builds. This is the permafrost. It's problematic in many ways. That crude doesn't come back. And the only way that the Russians were able to bring it back after the post-Cold War collapse was by bringing in Western technicians who are no longer available. So at some point later this year, we're looking at somewhere between 3 and 6 million barrels of Russian and Kazakh crude just falling off the market and never returning. That's not priced in yet because it hasn't happened yet, but we'll get there relatively soon. There are so many things moving, it's hard to put a number on the price. If this had happened very, very quickly back in March, we'd probably be talking about $170 crude. That might be a little bit high now because the Chinese have partially gone offline with their lockdowns. We've had a little bit of demand destruction. We've got the shale sector accelerating their output. They're probably going to be able to kick another 1.5 million barrels into the system before the end of the year. That suggests that 170 is probably a little high, but 150 is still a good kind of stake in the ground. Probably. The energy price is very fuzzy.